The fine showed up in my mailbox on the coldest morning of the year, wedged between a heating oil advertisement and my electric bill, which was already terrifying enough on its own. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees overnight, the kind of cold that turns your nose hairs into tiny icicles the second you step off the porch. I had about 6 inches of fresh snow on my driveway. My truck wouldn't start on the first 3 tries, and I was already 20 minutes behind on my morning routine. And then I opened that little white envelope with the Maplewood Ridge HOA logo stamped in the upper left corner, and my day went from bad to genuinely unbelievable. The fine was for $250. The violation: storing a second propane tank on my property during the winter season, which the notice claimed was in direct violation of Section 7, Subsection 4 of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards and Safety Guidelines. The notice was signed at the bottom by Debra Fairbanks, HOA Compliance and Enforcement Coordinator, with her little signature done in a looping, self-important cursive that told you everything you needed to know about the kind of person she was. I stood there on my front porch in my bathrobe and boots, snow blowing sideways into my face, and read that thing 3 times. $250 for a propane tank. Sitting on the side of my own house. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because the story is a lot better with the full picture. My name is Alex Wheeler, and I've lived in Maplewood Ridge for going on 6 years now. It's a nice neighborhood, genuinely. The houses are well maintained, the streets get plowed reasonably fast after a snowstorm, and the neighbors are mostly decent people. When I first moved in, the HOA was pretty low-key. Meetings happened quarterly, dues were reasonable, and nobody bothered you about anything serious unless you were actually doing something that affected your neighbors. Then, about 2 years ago, Debra Fairbanks ran for HOA Compliance and Enforcement Coordinator, a position that, I want to be clear, did not even exist before she proposed it. She got it added to the board structure with a very persuasive PowerPoint presentation about community standards erosion and property value protection. And then she ran unopposed because nobody else wanted the job. That was the moment Maplewood Ridge started changing. Debra is one of those people who was put on this earth specifically to find problems where none exist. She's somewhere in her mid-50s, always dressed like she's going to a PTA meeting even when she's just walking her dog, and she carries a little notebook where she writes down everything she considers a potential violation. She once fined Gerald Hutchins 2 houses down from me because his Christmas lights were still up on January 7th, which she argued constituted a storage of seasonal decorations beyond the permitted display window. Gerald paid the fine just to make her go away. I always told him he should have fought it, so when Debra started coming for me, I wasn't entirely shocked. What I was shocked about was the reason. Here's what actually happened. We had a brutal winter that year, the kind that weather people start calling historic in the first week of December. The whole region got slammed with back-to-back storms in November and December, and the cold snaps between them were savage. I heat my house with a gas furnace, and I have a propane-powered backup generator that I rely on when the power goes out, which happens more than you'd think in our area during winter storms, because the lines along the ridge are old and vulnerable to ice and heavy snow. My generator takes propane. Standard stuff. I have one 20-pound tank that I keep on the side of the house in a little storage area next to my outdoor equipment. I've had that set up since I moved in, and nobody ever said a word about it. But this particular winter, after the second major storm knocked out power for almost 4 days, and I ran through my tank and a half trying to keep the heat going and the sump pump working, I decided I was not going to get caught short again. So I bought a second 20-pound propane tank. Filled it up, put it right next to the first one on the side of my house, partially hidden by a wooden lattice panel I'd put up years ago. Practical, reasonable, completely legal under any actual fire code or safety regulation I'm aware of, because 2 20-pound tanks is nothing. People have multiple tanks for their grills all the time, but Debra Fairbanks spotted it. And this is where it gets good, because Debra didn't just spot it and send me a polite note. She photographed it, documented it, took notes, and then apparently went and combed through the Maplewood Ridge HOA governing documents until she found something she could use to justify a fine. The section she cited, Section 7, Subsection 4, was originally written about prohibiting the exterior storage of commercial fuel containers, meaning like large bulk tanks or business-scale propane setups. It was never intended to apply to a homeowner having two standard 20-pound barbecue-style tanks. But Debra read it the way she wanted to read it, filed her complaint, assessed the fine herself using the authority of her newly created coordinator position, and dropped that notice in my mailbox like she was serving a court summons. I went inside, made coffee, and started reading the actual HOA documents. See, here's something about me that Debra Fairbanks did not account for when she decided to come after me. I used to work in property management for almost 8 years before I switched careers. I've read more HOA bylaws, CC and RS, and community standards documents than most people have read novels. I know how these things are written, how they're interpreted, and more importantly, I know where the holes and the overreaches are. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know when someone's making things up or stretching language beyond its intended meaning. I pulled up the full Maplewood Ridge governing documents on my laptop, poured a second cup of coffee, and got to work while the snow continued to pile up outside. Section 7, Subsection 4. No resident shall store or maintain commercial-grade or bulk quantity fuel containers in exterior or visible areas of their property, including but not limited to propane tanks, in excess of those reasonably necessary for standard residential use. Okay, so first of all, commercial-grade or bulk quantity. Two 20-pound propane tanks are explicitly not commercial-grade. They are the same size tanks you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's for your gas grill. A commercial propane setup starts at around a 100-gallon tank minimum. We're talking 40 pounds of propane total at my house. That's a tailgate party's worth of propane, not a commercial operation. Second, in excess of those reasonably necessary for standard residential use. What is standard residential use? Because I'd argue that having a backup generator running for 4 days during a power outage in the middle of a historic winter is about as standard and residential as it gets. I wasn't running a propane business. I wasn't fueling a fleet of vehicles. I was keeping my house from turning into an icebox. Third, and most importantly, the subsection she cited was never adopted with the amendment process that the HOA's own bylaws required. I found that buried in the meeting minutes from 3 years ago. When Debra proposed expanding the enforcement of Section 7 to include residential propane storage, the motion was discussed but never formally voted on with a proper quorum. The language in the current document was revised after that meeting in a way that suggested the change had been passed, but looking at the actual vote record, they had 7 board members present and needed 5 to pass, and they only got 4. 3 voted against it and 1 abstained. That is not a majority. That revision should never have made it into the final document. I almost spilled my coffee. I sat back and looked out at the snow falling steadily in my backyard, the 2 propane tanks sitting there completely minding their own business next to my generator, and I smiled for the first time all morning. But I didn't move too fast. I knew Debra well enough to know that if I came at her immediately and aggressively, she'd find a way to escalate and make it worse. I needed to be methodical. So first, I responded to the fine notice in writing, keeping it polite and neutral, stating that I was reviewing the relevant documentation and would respond formally within the 30-day period allowed under the HOA's dispute process. That gave me time to build my case without tipping my hand. Then I started talking to my neighbors. The snow was actually helpful here, weirdly enough. When you live in a neighborhood and there's a big storm, You end up outside at the same time as everyone else because everybody's shoveling their driveways or helping dig out their cars. It creates this natural community gathering effect that doesn't really happen in nicer weather. So over the next few days, as I was out there working my snowblower and my neighbors were out with their shovels, I started having conversations. What I discovered was that Debra had been busy. I wasn't the only one who'd received a fine recently. Marcus and Linda Chen, 3 doors down, had gotten dinged $75 for having their garbage bins visible from the street for more than 24 hours, which happened because the garbage truck couldn't get down their street during a snowstorm and didn't come for 3 days. The bins were there because the garbage hadn't been picked up. Debra fined them anyway. Patricia Acaffer at the end of the block had been fined $150 for having a snow shovel leaning against her front porch railing, which Debra classified as improper exterior storage of equipment. A snow shovel, in December, on someone's porch. Old Pete Nakamura, who's been in the neighborhood for over 20 years and is probably the kindest man alive, had gotten a $50 fine for having salt bags stacked next to his front door, because apparently that was also exterior storage of materials. Pete was using those salt bags to deal with the ice on his walkway, which is a safety necessity when you're 73 years old and walking on icy concrete is a genuine fall risk. But Debra didn't care about Pete's hip or the ice. She cared about the letter of her interpretation of the rules. The thing that connected all of these fines was that they were all winter-related. Every single one of them was something that either happened because of the winter conditions or was a direct response to the winter conditions. And every single one of them had been cited by Debra Fairbanks, who seemed to be on some kind of winter patrol, walking around the neighborhood in her giant parka and that little notebook, writing down everything she could potentially turn into a fine. I started keeping notes of my own. Now, here's where I need to tell you about the cameras, because the cameras become important later. I put up a security camera system about 2 years ago. It's nothing fancy, just a few good quality outdoor cameras that cover my front door, my driveway, the side of my house where the propane tanks and generator are, and my backyard. I set them up after there was a string of car break-ins on our street, and I've kept them running ever since because the footage has been useful more than once. What I didn't mention yet, and what Debra certainly didn't know, was that the side camera had captured something very interesting. I went back through the footage from the week before I received the fine, and there was Debra Fairbanks, clear as day on camera, walking up the side of my property, past the lattice panel, getting very close to the propane tanks, spending a solid 2 minutes photographing them from multiple angles with her phone. Then, and this is the part that made me sit forward in my chair and watch the clip 3 more times, she reached over and moved the lattice panel. She physically moved my property to get a better view of the tanks, and then she took more photos, and then she walked away. That lattice panel is technically a fence structure, and under the HOA's own rules, moving or interfering with a resident's fence structure without permission is itself a violation. More importantly, it meant she was deliberately trying to make the tanks more visible, not just documenting them. She was staging the scene to make her violation complaint stronger. I saved that clip in about 5 different places. Then I called my neighbor Dave Kessler, who works in construction and knows everybody and everything in town, and told him what I'd found. Dave is one of those guys who, when something unfair is happening, immediately wants to rally the troops. He suggested we call a neighborhood meeting, but not a formal HOA meeting. Just an informal gathering of residents on our block to compare notes and figure out what was going on with all these fines. We hosted it at my house on a Saturday afternoon. I made a big pot of chili because it was genuinely freezing outside and people needed something warm. 10 households showed up, which I thought was a great turnout. People brought their fine notices. We spread them out on my dining room table and started going through them. In total, among the 10 households, There were 14 fines issued in the last 6 weeks, all during winter, all for things connected to the cold weather or the snowstorms. The total amount Debra had fined the neighborhood in 6 weeks came to just under $3,000. And here's where it got really interesting. Patricia, who works in finance, started asking a question that nobody had thought to ask yet. Where was the money going? Not where the fines went in theory, which was supposedly the HOA operating account, but where was it actually going? Because the HOA had just sent out a notice saying that the Common Area Landscaping Fund was insufficient and that they were going to need to assess a special fee next spring. But if Debra had been generating thousands of dollars in fines over the winter and doing it consistently given the rate we were seeing, that money should have been sitting in the account. Patricia asked to see the HOA's financial statements. Now, under the HOA's own bylaws, financial statements were supposed to be available to any resident who requested them in writing. Patricia sent that request the Monday after our neighborhood meeting, certified mail, return receipt requested, addressed to the HOA board treasurer. The treasurer was a quiet guy named Bob Finch, who mostly seemed to go along with whatever Debra wanted. He sent back a very brief response saying the statements were being prepared for the annual review and would be available at the spring meeting, which was not an answer to the question. When Patricia followed up requesting the most recent quarterly statement specifically, she got no response at all. That silence was loud. We were starting to piece together a picture that went beyond Debra just being a petty rule enforcer. If she was generating fines and the money wasn't showing up in the HOA's reported accounts, there was a much bigger problem here than a propane tank dispute. Meanwhile, my 30-day dispute window was ticking down, and I had spent the time very productively. I had the camera footage of Debra moving my lattice panel. I had the meeting minutes showing that the amendment to Section 7 had never properly passed. I had a written analysis of why 2 20-pound propane tanks didn't meet the definition of commercial-grade or bulk quantity containers. I had statements from Marcus and Linda Chen, Patricia Okafor, Pete Nakamura, and 3 other neighbors describing their fines and the circumstances around them. And I had a very interesting conversation with my cousin Rebecca, who happens to be a paralegal, who helped me put together a formal dispute letter that hit every single point cleanly and professionally. I submitted the dispute letter to the HOA board on a Wednesday morning, sent certified mail to every board member individually, which was something I was allowed to do under the bylaws, and I also emailed it to the community mailing list address that all residents were subscribed to, because the bylaws didn't say I couldn't share dispute correspondence with the community. The response from Debra came fast. Too fast, actually, which told me she was rattled. She sent back a letter, again signed in that looping cursive, stating that my dispute had been reviewed and denied, and that the fine stood, and furthermore that she was adding an additional $50 administrative fee for what she called a frivolous dispute submission. She also added a note at the bottom, and I want to quote this directly because it's important. It has also come to our attention that you have been canvassing neighbors and sharing private HOA correspondence in an unauthorized manner, which may constitute a violation of community conduct standards. Further action may be taken if this behavior continues. I read that letter, set it down on my kitchen table, and felt something shift in my chest. That wasn't the feeling of being intimidated. That was the feeling of someone who has been handed exactly the ammunition they needed to make their case substantially stronger. Attempting to silence a resident for exercising their legal right to discuss HOA matters with neighbors is not something you can do under most state HOA governance laws. And adding a punitive administrative fee for a dispute that she had unilaterally denied herself, rather than bringing it to the full board, was procedurally improper under the HOA's own rules. The dispute was supposed to go to a review committee, not be decided by the enforcement coordinator alone. Rebecca, my paralegal cousin, flagged both of those things immediately when I forwarded her the letter. I also went back to check on one more thing that had been nagging at me. Debra had mentioned private HOA correspondence in her letter, but the only correspondence I'd shared with my neighbors were the fine notices I personally received, which were addressed to me. Those aren't private HOA correspondence. Those are documents sent to me that I own. Sharing them is completely within my rights. By this point, Patricia had also gotten nowhere with the financial statement request, and she had done some research of her own. Under our state's laws governing HOA associations, residents had the right to inspect financial records, and if the HOA failed to produce them within a specific timeframe after a proper written request, that was a statutory violation. Patricia's request was now past that timeframe. We decided it was time to bring in the state's HOA oversight process. I know some people don't realize this exists, but most states have some form of regulatory body or process for handling HOA complaints, especially about financial transparency. Patricia filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Regulatory Commission, documenting the failure to produce financial records, and included the documented evidence we had about the pattern of fines and the procedural irregularities. Then things really started to move. About 2 weeks after Patricia filed that complaint, we got a notice that the state had opened an inquiry into Maplewood Ridge HOA's financial records and governance practices. The HOA board was required to produce complete financial statements for the prior 2 years within 30 days. Debra's response to this news was visible and immediate. She sent an all-community email that was framed as a routine update, but was clearly an attempt to get ahead of the situation. It talked about the HOA's strong financial position, ongoing commitment to community standards, and made a very pointed comment about how outside interference from a small group of disgruntled residents was creating unnecessary disruption. It was the kind of email you send when you're scared and trying to control the narrative. But the neighborhood had already been talking. Our informal group had grown from 10 households to over 24, and people were paying attention now in a way they hadn't before. Several residents went back and looked at their own fine histories and started finding similar patterns: fines assessed during unusual circumstances, fines that seemed to stretch the language of the governing documents, and amounts that added up to a lot of money flowing into the HOA's accounts over the past 2 years since Debra took her position. Dave Kessler actually did some rough math. He estimated, conservatively, that if Debra had been running this level of fine activity across the entire 43-home community for the past 2 years, the total revenue generated could be somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000, depending on the frequency and amounts. The HOA's annual budget for operations was about $90,000. Fine revenue was never supposed to be a significant income source. It was supposed to be a deterrent, not a revenue stream. When the state inquiry produced its results, that math started to look a lot more alarming. The state regulators produced a full audit of the HOA's financial records, and what they found was not good. Fine revenues had been dramatically underreported in the official financial statements that were shared with residents. There was a separate account, opened in the HOA's name but with only 2 authorized signatories, that had accumulated over $40,000 over 22 months. The 2 authorized signatories were Debra Fairbanks and Bob Finch, the treasurer. Not all of the HOA board members even knew this account existed. The audit showed that fine revenues were being deposited into this second account rather than the primary operating account, and that money had been used for a range of expenses that were not properly authorized or documented as HOA expenditures. Some of those expenses were ambiguous enough that they could potentially have been HOA-related, but others were clearly personal in nature. There were charges for hotel stays, restaurant meals, and at least one charge from what appeared to be a travel agency, all in amounts and patterns that didn't correspond to any documented HOA business. When the State Regulatory Commission referred the matter to the county district attorney's office, things moved into territory I genuinely hadn't expected when I opened that fine notice on my frozen porch that morning. Debra Fairbanks and Bob Finch were both charged with misappropriation of HOA funds, which is a criminal offense in our state. I won't pretend to be the world's foremost expert on the specific legal terminology, but the short version is that they had been systematically diverting resident-funded money into an account they controlled and spending it on things that had nothing to do with the Maplewood Ridge community. Debra's aggressive fine campaign, the winter push that had hit so many residents, wasn't just about her being power-hungry and petty, though she certainly was both of those things. It was also about generating revenue for a scheme. The day the charges were filed, 2 police cars were parked in front of Debra's house in the morning. I didn't go outside to watch because that felt wrong. But I won't pretend I didn't look out my window. I did. I watched her come out in her big parka, the same one she wore on her neighborhood patrols with that notebook, and she looked smaller somehow. Not the commanding, self-certain presence she usually projected. Just a person standing in the cold next to a police car while the officers explained what was happening. Bob Finch turned himself in at the county sheriff's office the same morning, apparently after being contacted by his attorney the night before. Both of them were released on bail, but they were both immediately suspended from all HOA board activities pending the criminal proceedings. The remaining board members held an emergency meeting, which was open to all residents, and it was the most packed HOA meeting Maplewood Ridge had ever seen. People were sitting on the floor of the community room at the rec center. There were folding chairs pulled in from the hallway. It was standing room only. I sat in the 3rd row with Dave Kessler and Patricia Acaffer and Marcus and Linda Chen on either side of me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time sitting in that community room. I felt like this place was actually a community. The remaining board members were a mix of people. Some were clearly embarrassed and just wanted to get through the meeting. One woman, Carol Hensley, who'd been on the board for years and genuinely seemed to have no idea about the secondary account, was visibly upset and made a point of saying publicly that she had never been informed of the separate account and had not benefited from it in any way. I believed her. She'd always seemed like a reasonable person. The board voted that night to hire an outside management company to handle HOA finances on an interim basis while the legal process played out. They also voted to establish a resident oversight committee with real authority to review financial statements quarterly. They voted Patricia onto that committee. And they voted to rescind all fines issued in the prior year that were currently in dispute or had been paid under protest, pending a full review against the properly adopted governing documents. That last vote got a round of applause that I think startled some of the board members. My $250 fine was one of the first on the rescinded list. So were Marcus and Linda's garbage bin fine, Patricia's snow shovel fine, and Pete Nakamura's salt bag fine. Over the course of the next month, the committee reviewed the full fine history and ended up reversing or crediting back over 60% of the fines issued during Debra's tenure, on the grounds that they had been improperly assessed, procedurally defective, or based on rules that had never been properly adopted. The HOA sent out refund checks to dozens of residents. Mine arrived on a Tuesday. $250, plus a $50 credit toward next year's dues as an acknowledgement of the improper administrative fee Debra had tried to tack on. I deposited it the same afternoon, and then went to the hardware store and bought a 3rd propane tank for good measure. Completely kidding. I only have 2. They're still there on the side of the house, still completely minding their own business. Now let me tell you about the moment that I think about whenever I need a reminder that doing things the right way actually works sometimes. About 3 weeks after the board meeting, I ran into Pete Nakamura outside. He was out shoveling his walk, which he insists on doing himself because he says it keeps him sharp, and I stopped to help him with a section near the street where the snowplow had left a particularly nasty pile of heavy, packed snow. We worked on it together for a while without talking much, just the scrape of shovels and the sound of the wind. Then Pete stopped and leaned on his shovel and said, "You know, when I got that fine for the salt bags, I actually thought about selling the house." I looked at him. Pete's been in his house for over 20 years. He and his wife raised their kids there. "I thought, if this is what this neighborhood is now, maybe I don't want to be here anymore," he said. He shook his head. "I'm glad I didn't." I told him I was glad he didn't either, and I meant it. As for Debra Fairbanks and Bob Finch, the legal process took the better part of the following year to work through, as these things do. The criminal case moved at its own pace through the system. I won't pretend to have perfect visibility into every detail of the legal proceedings, because a lot of that happened outside of what residents were informed about directly. What I can tell you is what became a matter of public record. Both Debra and Bob ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges in a plea agreement. Debra was convicted of misappropriation of funds and sentenced to 2 years of probation, required to pay full restitution to the HOA for the improperly spent money, ordered to complete a significant number of community service hours, and permanently barred from serving in any HOA governance role in the state. The restitution amount was substantial, somewhere in the range of $32,000 once all the unauthorized expenditures were fully accounted for. Bob Finch received a similar sentence with somewhat reduced restitution obligations based on the prosecutor's assessment of his relative culpability. The Maplewood Ridge HOA put every dollar of that restitution into a reserve fund for community improvements. The following spring, they used part of it to finally fix the pothole situation at the entrance to the neighborhood that people had been complaining about for 3 years, and to upgrade the lighting in the common areas along the walking path. Small things, but good things. Debra's house went on the market about 4 months after the guilty plea. She moved out quietly during the week without much fanfare. I didn't see her leave. A young couple moved in about 2 months later with a large, enthusiastic golden retriever who immediately became the most popular resident on the block. The dog's name is Biscuit, and he has never once filed a violation notice against anyone. But I want to go back and fill in a few things I glossed over because the story between when I got that fine notice and when the criminal charges were filed was not a straight line. There were some rocky moments in there that are worth telling properly. The rockiest one came about 3 weeks into the dispute period, before the state inquiry had really gotten moving and before the full scope of what was happening with the finances became clear. Debra showed up at my door, in person. She knocked on my front door on a Saturday morning at about 9 o'clock, and when I opened it, she was standing there in her parka with her notebook. And for a moment I just looked at her and she looked at me. She started talking in a tone that was very carefully calibrated to be friendly but firm, the kind of tone someone uses when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. She said she hoped we could work this out neighbor to neighbor, that she understood I had concerns about the fine and that perhaps there was room for some flexibility, and that she was sure we both wanted what was best for the community. I stepped back and asked her if she wanted to come in out of the cold. She said yes, and came in, and I made her a cup of coffee because that's just how I was raised, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I let her talk. She talked for a while about community values and property values, and how the standards existed to protect everyone, and how she hoped I understood she was just doing her job. And I nodded and listened and didn't interrupt. And when she finished, I put my coffee cup down and said, very calmly, that I appreciated her coming over, and that I did understand she saw herself as doing her job, but that I had some concerns I wanted to share with her. And then I laid out every single point. The meeting minutes showing the amendment hadn't properly passed. the definition of commercial-grade versus residential-scale propane containers, the camera footage of her moving my lattice panel, the pattern of winter finds across the neighborhood, the procedural problems with her denying my dispute unilaterally, all of it laid out clearly and quietly. Debra's expression shifted through several phases during that conversation. Skepticism at first, then attention, then something that looked like calculation, and by the end she was very still and not making much eye contact. She said she would take my concerns under advisement and get back to me. She thanked me for the coffee and left. She never got back to me directly. Instead, I got that letter doubling down on the fine and adding the administrative fee. But I could tell from how she was at that kitchen table that she knew she was on shaky ground. The escalation in the letter wasn't confidence. It was a cornered response. The other difficult moment came when Debra sent a message to the community mailing list that implied I was behind some kind of organized harassment campaign against the HOA, and that she had received threats, which she absolutely had not, and that the board was considering legal action against residents who were engaging in what she called coordinated intimidation. That email was designed to frighten people into backing off, and it did give a few of the less assertive neighbors some pause. Dave Kessler called me the night that email went out, and he was hot about it. He wanted to respond publicly and aggressively right away. I told him to wait. I told him the best thing we could do was not react emotionally, because that would give her exactly the narrative she was trying to create. The accusations of threats and harassment were provably false, and if we stayed calm and documented, that would be clear. Getting into a public shouting match would muddy the water. Dave trusted me, reluctantly, and we held back. Then Patricia's regulatory complaint got picked up, and the whole thing shifted from a neighborhood argument to a formal investigation. And suddenly, Debra's email about harassment campaigns looked very different in context. When the investigators started interviewing residents, everyone who spoke to them gave the same consistent picture. Community members who had compared notes about fines they thought were unfair, and a finance committee member who had filed a proper regulatory complaint through legitimate channels. Nobody had threatened or intimidated anyone. What Debra had called a harassment campaign was just people paying attention and using the processes available to them. The investigators were also quite interested in that all-community email and its timing relative to the regulatory inquiry. I'll leave it at that. There were a few other things that came out during the inquiry that I think are worth mentioning, because they paint a fuller picture of what had been happening in Maplewood Ridge under Debra's watch. The compliance and enforcement coordinator position that Debra had created for herself came with a stipend. $50 per month, which doesn't sound like much, but Debra had quietly voted herself an enhanced stipend at some point in the prior year that brought it up to $300 per month, and that change had never been disclosed to the full community as required by the bylaws. She had also authorized herself reimbursement for expenses she described as related to compliance monitoring, which included things like her phone plan and her vehicle mileage for driving around the neighborhood. And those reimbursements were coming from the main HOA account, while the fine revenues were going into the secondary account. So essentially, residents were paying her to walk around and fine them, and then the fine money she collected wasn't even going into the community's benefit. The more we learned, the more remarkable it was that she'd kept it running for as long as she had. But it's not actually that hard to understand. Most people don't read the HOA governing documents. Most people, when they get a fine for something petty, just pay it and grumble about it privately. Most people don't think to look at the financial statements or wonder where the money is going. Debra had correctly identified that the vast majority of residents would just absorb the fines without pushing back, and she'd built her scheme on that assumption. She just ran into the wrong guy with the propane tank. I don't say that to take too much credit, because the truth is that Patricia's financial instincts were what cracked the real case open, And Dave's energy and willingness to organize the neighborhood was what gave us the critical mass to make our complaints impossible to ignore. And Pete Nakamura and Marcus and Linda, and all the others who showed up and shared their stories gave the whole thing the weight it needed. This was never really about my fine. It was about a community that had let one person accumulate too much unchecked power, and was now doing the work of taking that power back through legitimate means. But I will say that the propane tank, sitting there on the side of my house through the whole winter while all of this unfolded, started to feel like a mascot. Every time I went out to check on the generator or do anything on the side of the house, I'd look at those two tanks and think, you started something. After everything settled down and the new HOA structure was in place and the oversight committee was functioning, we had a neighborhood block party in late spring. It was warm enough finally, genuinely warm, and people had been cooped up through one of the hardest winters in memory. So when the weather broke, there was this collective exhale that you could almost feel the whole neighborhood taking at once. We closed off our end of the street. Somebody brought a massive grill. There were tables of food from something like a dozen different households, and the kids were running around in the street like they'd been released from captivity. I grilled burgers and hot dogs for about 2 hours straight. I used propane. Both tanks got a workout that day, and I enjoyed every second of it. At some point during the evening, when things had slowed down and people were just sitting around talking, Pete Nakamura came over and sat down next to me in a lawn chair and handed me a cold drink. "You know what I realized?" he said. I asked him what. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 23 years, he said, "and this is the first time I actually know most of these people." He gestured around at all the conversations happening, neighbors who had been strangers or near strangers before the winter, now sitting together and laughing. All of that had to happen for this to happen. I thought about that for a while. It was a generous way to look at it. An HOA enforcement scheme that bilked residents out of tens of thousands of dollars was a pretty expensive way to build community. But Pete had a point that there was something real and lasting that came out of it. When you go through something together, even something frustrating and stressful and unfair, it creates a kind of bond. People who might have waved politely for years without ever having a real conversation now knew each other's names, knew each other's stories, showed up for each other. A few months later, the HOA held its annual meeting and elections, and the changes from the prior year's upheaval were evident in everything. The new board structure included formal resident oversight with actual authority. Financial statements were distributed to the full community quarterly, no request necessary. The compliance and enforcement coordinator position had been eliminated entirely, and enforcement responsibilities were distributed among the full board with required majority votes for any fine above $50, plus a mandatory review committee for any dispute. The stipend structure had been overhauled and disclosed completely. The meeting had the highest resident attendance in the HOA's history. People were engaged and asking questions and holding the board accountable in real time. It was genuinely what an HOA meeting is supposed to look like. Someone nominated me to serve on the board. I said no, which I feel was the correct decision for my blood pressure. But I told them I'd be at every meeting and they'd know if something wasn't right. That got a laugh. Patricia was elected to the board as treasurer, which was entirely fitting. Marcus Chen was elected to fill one of the at-large board seats. The new board moved fast and competently, and had none of the procedural shadiness that had characterized the prior 2 years. The criminal case against Debra and Bob continued to work its way through the courts for the better part of the following year, but by then the immediate practical consequences had already played out. The money was being recovered through restitution. The governance was fixed. The community was intact and actually stronger than before. One of the last things I want to tell you about is something small that happened about a month after the block party. I got a letter, not from the HOA this time. A handwritten letter on plain paper, not even a full page. It was from Bob Finch. He apologized. Not in a legal way, not in a way that seemed like it had been vetted by an attorney. Just a personal letter saying he was sorry for his part in what happened, and that he understood if residents couldn't forgive him. He said he had convinced himself it wasn't that big a deal, that it was just money going toward things that were sort of community adjacent, and that he knew now that was not a justification, and that he'd hurt people who trusted the HOA to be honest. It was a strange thing to receive. I sat with it for a while. Bob Finch was not the mastermind of any of it. He was a weak person who went along with something he knew was wrong because Debra was persuasive, and he didn't have the spine to push back. That's its own kind of failing, but it's a different kind than Debra's. I wrote him a brief letter back saying I received his and that I hoped he made good on his restitution obligations and tried to do better. I meant it. I did not write to Debra. I don't think she sent any letters. The second winter after all of this, the one that followed the spring when everything got resolved, was cold but not as brutal as the historic one that had started everything. Still plenty of snow, still plenty of the kind of cold that gets into your bones if you're outside for more than about 20 minutes, but manageable. I kept both my propane tanks. I filled them before the first storm and kept them full all season. The generator ran 3 times over the course of the winter, which turned out to be just a mild inconvenience, and every time I fired it up and it hummed along reliably, I thought about how all of this started with me deciding I didn't want to run out of propane again. My neighbor on the immediate right side, a woman named Joanne who I'd barely spoken to before the whole HOA situation, came over one afternoon in January when I was out checking the generator after a cold snap, and she saw the 2 tanks and laughed and said she always thought of them as the tanks that changed everything. I told her that was giving them too much credit. She said maybe, but also maybe not. There's something genuinely absurd about the fact that 2 20-pound propane tanks, the kind you can buy at any big box store for $35 each, managed to set off a chain of events that led to criminal charges, a state investigation, a full financial audit, and a community reckoning with how it had been governed for the past 2 years. If Debra Fairbanks had just left me alone, or even sent me a friendly note suggesting I move the tanks to a less visible spot, none of the rest of it would have happened. The financial scheme might have run for another year or 2 before someone figured it out. Or maybe it never would have gotten figured out at all and she'd have just quietly kept going. But she couldn't leave it alone, because that was the thing about Debra. She wasn't built for restraint. She was built for escalation. Every situation had to be dominated, every rule had to be maximally enforced, every opportunity to assert authority had to be taken. It was that quality that made her effective at creating a climate of compliance among the residents. And it was that same quality that made her incapable of just walking past 2 propane tanks and deciding it wasn't worth the fight. She walked up to my house, moved my lattice panel, photographed my tanks, went home and researched a justification, wrote up a fine notice and dropped it in my mailbox. All for 2 20-pound propane tanks on the side of a house in the middle of winter. She had no idea what she was starting, and I'm genuinely glad she did it, as strange as that sounds, not for my sake specifically. The $250 meant something at the time, but it's not going to change my life either way. I'm glad she did it because if she hadn't, Pete Nakamura might have sold his house of 23 years over a $50 salt bag fine. The Chen family might have just kept paying fines that were designed to wear them down. Patricia might never have started asking questions about the finances. Dozens of residents might have continued just quietly absorbing the losses and the indignities without ever knowing they had the right and the ability to push back. What Debra tried to do was make an example of me, and instead she handed me exactly the leverage I needed to make an example of the entire system she'd built. The neighborhood is good now. Really good. There's a level of engagement and accountability that wasn't there before. People actually read the HOA documents. People actually show up to meetings. When something looks off, someone asks a question. That's not a small thing. That's actually how it's supposed to work, and it took a season of absurd winter fines and a propane tank standoff to remind everyone of that. And the tanks are still there, right where they've always been, next to my generator behind the lattice panel, visible if you're really looking for them. Nobody's looked for them again, which is exactly how it should be.